In 1988, the George H.W. Bush campaign saturated the media airways with pictures, ads, and commercials featuring dog-whistling images of Horton. Horton had raped a white female while he was temporarily released from prison on a weekend furlough program where he was already serving a life sentence for first-degree murder. Through the successful manipulation of this image, Bush was able to align himself with masses of white voters who felt victimized as the gains of the civil rights movement in housing, education, and employment increased diversity in formerly exclusive spaces. Through the use of this image, Bush reached deep within the American psyche and heart, successfully launching a presidential campaign against Michael Dukakis. In response to the Bush campaign's use of Willie Horton imagery, Susan Estrich, Dukakis' campaign manager, told a reporter, quote, "There is no stronger metaphor for racial hatred in our country than the black man raping the white woman," end of quote. Over the years, powerful interests have been able to exact tax cuts for the wealthy that we've not seen since the Great Depression, and hordes of poor and working people are experiencing diminishing images of their middle-class aspirations. Shamefully, Willie Horton may have titillated our psyche, but he will not feed our empty stomachs. Willie Horton is a paradigmatic example of how images inform political discourse, how political discourse informs carceral policy. Americans' prison population increased from 300,000 in early 1970s to 2.3 million people today, not because of ideas, but because of action. Without doubt, the media is a mainstream instrument that racializes crime by reproducing racial profiles of criminality and innocence. Like other instruments of power, domination, and exploitation, the media uses the black body as a canvas for criminality and the white body as a portrait of goodness, righteousness, and entitlement. Without doubt, the use of racial profiles of black menace and white innocence increases the vulnerability of black bodies. The media participates in death by imagery when it uses the black body as evidence of crime and the white body as evidence of innocence. The media, however, is not the source of the problem. We are a nation of supply and demand. The media merely gives us what we crave. The question becomes, why do we racialize innocence and criminality? Why are these images titillating to our psyches and consciousness? If we're honest with ourselves, our world demonizes blackness and valorizes whiteness. If we are honest with ourselves, our nation criminalizes black bodies and presumes the innocence of white ones. If we're honest with ourselves, we select our neighborhoods based on how white they are and sell our homes when our communities become unbearably black. If we're honest with ourselves, we protect and reproduce our white images and legacies in our families while relegating black bodies to domestic service and protection of that birthright. If we're honest with ourselves, our only interest in blackness is the way it affirms our own images of ourselves. The media did not invent the dog-whistling politics of Willie Horton or the racial demagoguery of black boys in hoodies. The media merely feeds our insatiable appetite for vulnerable flesh. Although the media participates in and informs public discourse, the media cannot create images that do not already reside in our heads and hearts. In reproducing racial images of criminality and goodness, the media reaches into the deeper folds of our cerebral cortex and titillates deeply held convictions about white goodness and black menace. In projecting these images of criminality and goodness, the media is merely reproducing a page from a much larger narrative. That narrative is the legacy of white supremacy. It is fundamentally vital that we ground our discussion about the media's role in creating racial profiles of criminality and innocence in the larger theoretical framework of white supremacy. White supremacy is the motive, the criminal justice system is its instrument, the media is merely taking a Polaroid of white supremacy's performance of domination, rule, and exploitation on bodies of color. Under the narrative of white supremacy, the black body is itself the evidence of crime, and the white body is itself evidence of innocence. Historically, criminalizing the black body has always been a justification for exploitation. From free labor to cheap labor, to fodder for the school-to-prison pipeline, and now to possible obsolescence because there are new bodies of color to fill the need for cheap labor, the criminal justice system and the law as expressions of power have consistently made the black body its captive. Imprisonment does the work of disenfranchisement, arrests do the work of subordination, and sentencing does the work of domination. As a racial project or formation, white supremacy has historically had two aims: conquest and exploitation. I want to use the critical analytical tool of space and place to capture the operations of white supremacy as a theoretical framework in which to ground this conversation, but also to briefly map its historical operation. So white supremacy occupies, totalizes, and usurps unrestricted space, and relegates certain bodies to places where the conditions of vulnerability to exploitation abound. So, for example, the colonial empire discovered America and relegated the indigenous populations outside the protections of citizenship into areas of genocide. As another example, the founding fathers proclaimed a constitutional democracy and relegated the black body outside the borders of citizenship to auction blocks where they were vulnerable to the wildest and most pathological desires and whims. In its latest incarnation, white supremacy has morphed into explicit and implicit bias, like a multi-headed hydra, and highly adaptable and refusing interruption and having outlasted racism and intolerance. Traditionally, implicit bias is defined as the subconscious associations we make between races and social attributes, like goodness and whiteness and menace and blackness. There is, however, nothing new about implicit bias. Implicit bias is white supremacy by any other name. What is new is the cognitive studies and neuroscience that allows us to capture and map the operations of white supremacy in the mind and its manifestations in the world. It is the perversion of perception produced by our privilege. It is an implicit imperative so deeply held and convicted that it eludes scrutiny. It is the filter through which we experience reality. It is the framework through which we see evidence, including police officers, federal agents, prosecutors, grand jurors, petite jurors, and the public at large. It is the way pathology always sticks to the black body and goodness clings to the white body. Implicit biases are the schema-consistent pairings, stereotypes, and associations we automatically draw between whiteness and power, entitlement, goodness, virtue, righteousness, intelligence, innocence, trustworthiness, industriousness, and boundlessness. By contrast, implicit biases are the associations we make between black bodies and worthlessness, evil, immorality, criminality, ignorance, guilt, slothfulness, lasciviousness, enslavement, and servitude. In video game shooter simulations, implicit bias testing indicates that we're more inclined to see black bodies holding guns when they are actually holding relatively innocent things like flashlights, and that we're less likely to see white bodies holding guns when in fact they are armed. Most importantly, these simulations also indicate that we're more inclined to shoot black bodies as opposed to white bodies, regardless of what those bodies are holding. I urge you to also go to Project Implicit. which is a Harvard University-run website. You can simply Google this, where you'll have an opportunity to actually take an implicit aptitude test, also known as the IAT. The IAT is a simple 10-minute test that measures the amount of time individuals take to make an association with an image or word they view on a computer screen. Over 14 million IATs have been taken. 75% of those who've taken the IAT race test have demonstrated implicit racial bias in favor of whites. Given that 75% figure, implicit bias makes the case for omnipresent racial hostility in a world that believes it has achieved post-racialism. Emancipation was met with Jim Crow. The civil rights movement was answered by the school-to-prison pipeline. The election of President Obama gave rise to the Tea Party. While the Ferguson protesters engaged in resistance, Darren Wilson amassed $1 million. The march towards social justice is a constant dialectical tension between progress and retrenchment, a movement forward and an equally aggressive movement backward. Much like Sisyphus condemned to rolling a boulder up a hill, the movement towards social justice must anticipate the gravitational pull towards resistance. The racially coded dog-whistling politics and racial demagoguery of Willie Horton arguably gave rise to the popularity of Donald Trump in the public square. I'm digressing for just a moment, but I will make a point, I promise you. Elite power brokers seize and I will also make you laugh in the process, or at least I hope I will. Elite power brokers seize the image of Willie Horton to give themselves a greatly needed cosmetic facelift, morphing from a party of the rich to the champion of the victim, particularly those individuals who experience victimization and trauma from the inclusive gains of the civil rights movement. Willie Horton became a clarion call for those who saw dwindling value in their racial real estate as once formerly exclusive enclaves in boardrooms, lunchrooms, and boudoirs gave way to increasingly more diverse spaces. As a vision of triumph, power, and success, Donald Trump taps into the day-to-day realities of the white masses. He is the Barbie doll of the American dream. In Trump, at least I made one person laugh. In Trump, the white masses act out their fantasy of making it rich through popularity, superiority, and celebrity. In perfecting his power, celebrity, and platform, Trump is able to spew racist, vituperative vitriol and be embraced as a champion of white victimization, trauma, and vindication. In Trump, we see a perfect storm of power, amassing celebrity to launch a political platform of racist vitriol and civil rights resentments. In fixating on Willie Horton and championing Donald Trump, the white masses have failed to realize that their middle-class aspirations have been stolen away. Neither Willie Horton nor drug dealers collapsed our economy. However, we have had a war on drugs and not on unregulated banking practices. The criminalization of the black body immunizes us from other forms of criminality and treachery when white bodies commit those crimes. When we fixated on the Black menace and answered the civil rights gains with the school-to-prison pipeline, we turned away from America as the Great Society and the New Deal, and instead embraced the collective loss of our humanity. The dehumanization of the black body necessitates an equal loss of humanity in the dominator. The question becomes, why should we break the cycle of replicating and reproducing racially coded images of criminality and goodness? Why should we abort the legacy of white supremacy? Why should we embrace the cause of inclusivity and greater human flourishing? Why should we interrupt the collective loss of our humanity? Why should the media discontinue the racialization of crime and reproduction of black menace and white innocence? So I suggest the following by way of answers. Because the criminalization of black bodies and the overvalorization of whiteness turns police officers into warriors and enemy combatants in black communities and protectors and allies in white neighborhoods. Because death by imagery increases the instances of police violence and excessive use of force against bodies of color, cheapens Black existence, increases danger for Black lives, and dehumanizes all that fall within its gaze. Because Natasha McKenna, 37, died after police officers tased her 4 times while she lay naked and shackled with handcuffs and leg restraints. Because police officers subjected Alexandria Randall and Brandy Hamilton to full-blown cavity searches in the middle of the day in full view of a public highway after a traffic stop. Because Black men are 7 times more likely than white men to die by police gunfire while unarmed. Because the dog-whistling effect of feasting on Black flesh distracts us from the treachery of focusing greatly needed resources on denigration and imprisonment rather than human uplift. Given those reasons, what solutions do I propose? How do we break the legitimizing role the media plays in racializing crime? How do we get the press to stop embracing the theme of white innocence and Black denigration? How do we shift the normative gaze, the gaze of judgment, from the Black body to the conditions that give rise to tyranny, subjugation, and domination as it's race, gendered, and classed? In answer to these questions, I would like to propose 2 categories of solutions. One category directed at the media itself as an institution, and the second category requesting a partnership with the media in a call to action. I should note that given the ubiquitous and omnipresent nature of explicit and implicit imperatives, I call them imperatives rather than biases, our response must be equally robust and comprehensive. The following suggestions, therefore, are not an exclusive list. As to the first category, greater diversity throughout the ranks of law enforcement as well as the media. By increasing the diversity of bodies within the ranks of both law enforcement and the media, we can increase the life experiences and points of view of our institutions. Diversifying these institutions will enhance their intentionality, dialogue, and activity. Require implicit bias training throughout the ranks of law enforcement as well as the media. If we're truly committed to full human flourishing, we must all become aware of how our thought processes lead to action, which is sometimes fatal and damaging to others. As to the second category of solutions, we ask the media to join us in a partnership on the following calls to action. Bringing constitutional policing in line with racial justice. We are asking the media to engage in responsible reporting by focusing its attention on policing and policing strategies that are not in lockstep with the Constitution. Around the nation, there are countless images of racial profiling that lead to disastrous consequences. As an example of socially responsible reporting, National Public Radio, The Washington Times, and CNN reported that in 2013, and I want to slow this down. I'm going to give you some empirical information with respect to Ferguson. I don't want to dwell on this for too long, but I wanted to put the rage in Ferguson in some context. My argument is that context is over-policing. But again, I won't spend very much time on this. I just want to offer it as an example of responsible policing. So in 2013, the municipal court in Ferguson, a city of 21,135 people, issued 32,975 arrest warrants for nonviolent offenses, mostly driving violations. That is approximately 1.6 arrest warrants for every Ferguson citizen. Blacks make up 67% of the city's population, but were 86% of motorists stopped by police. Whites make up 29% of the population, but 12.7% of vehicles stopped. Last year, Ferguson collected $2.6 million in court fees and fines, and it was the city's second biggest source of income of the $20 million it collected in revenues. by way of other solutions very quickly, and then in closing. Eliminate the criminalizing of black bodies for profit from private prisons to excessive traffic and parking fines. Eliminate the use of immigration policies as opportunity policing. Explore the possibilities of using implicit bias tests as screening devices in law enforcement. The demand of greater transparency and data collection with respect to racial profiling. And in closing, if we maximize the benefit of full human flourishing, we minimize the costs of supremacist pathology. The denigration of millions destroys the psyche of all. In generations to come, our offspring will measure our humanity not by exaltations of white innocence, but by ascriptions of black guilt. As we condemn past generations for engaging in the diabolical treachery that was slavery, we might ask ourselves how future generations will judge our sending 1 in every 3 black men to prison.